The year is 1462. A forest stretches for miles, but it's not made of trees. It's made of thousands of impaled bodies, rotting under the Balkan sun. A silent, terrifying warning. This was the work of a man whose name still whispers fear across centuries. The man who inspired the myth of Dracula. How did one prince become so utterly consumed by a thirst for terror and revenge that he transcended human cruelty to become a legend of pure evil? What twisted psychology creates a monster whose methods of warfare were acts of unimaginable sadism? Welcome to Anatomy of Dread. In this documentary, we will peel back the layers of myth to perform a psychological autopsy on Vlad the Impaler. We will dissect the brutal world that shaped him, the chilling methods he employed, and the true horror he inflicted. By the end, you will understand the real dread that birthed the world's most infamous monster. A truth far more disturbing than any vampire tale. To understand the monster, we must first understand the man, and the brutal world that forged him. Vlad III was born in 1431 in Transylvania, a region then known as Wallachia, caught in the terrifying crossroads of two colossal powers, Christian Europe and the encroaching Ottoman Empire. His very name, Dracula, was inherited from his father, Vlad II, Dracula, a knight of the Order of the Dragon, an order dedicated to fighting the Ottomans. Dracula meant dragon, but also devil. This duality would define his son. From a psychological perspective, Vlad's childhood was a masterclass in trauma and political instability. At a young age, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court by their own father. This was a common, brutal diplomatic practice, a guarantee of peace. For Vlad, it was years of captivity, psychological torment, and forced indoctrination. He was held prisoner, exposed daily to the brutal realities of Ottoman power, including the practice of impalement as a method of execution. This period of captivity was the crucible in which Vlad's future cruelty was forged. He witnessed firsthand the absolute, ruthless exercise of power. He learned that fear was the ultimate weapon, and that to survive in a world without mercy, one had to be even more merciless. While his brother Radu seemed to adapt, even thrive, in the Ottoman court, Vlad simmered with resentment, a deep-seated desire for vengeance, and a profound understanding of how to inflict terror. When he finally returned to Wallachia, it was to find his father and elder brother brutally murdered by rival bourgeois nobles, who had sided with Hungary. Wallachia was a land constantly torn by internal strife, foreign invasion, and shifting elite. This personal betrayal, coupled with years of Ottoman captivity, solidified Vlad's worldview. The world was a place of endless enemies, and survival depended on absolute, unquestioning, and terrifying power. His early life was an anatomy of dread, a constant struggle for survival in a land where treachery was currency, and death was always a breath away. It was this crucible of fear and vengeance that molded the young prince into the brutal ruler who would soon unleash a reign of terror, unlike anything Europe had ever seen, forever etching his name into the annals of fear and inspiring the legend of Dracula. Returning to a fractured Wallachia, Vlad's first taste of power was fleeting. He seized the throne with Hungarian support, only to be quickly overthrown. But his ambition was relentless, and in 1456, he finally reclaimed his rightful place. It was during this second, longer reign that Vlad III would transform himself from a vengeful prince into Vlad the Impaler, a name that would echo in terror for centuries. From a psychological perspective, Vlad's methods were not random acts of cruelty. They were a meticulously calculated strategy of state-sponsored terror, designed to achieve absolute control in a lawless land. He had learned in the Ottoman court that fear was the most potent weapon, and he applied this lesson with chilling precision. His primary tool, and the one that cemented his fearsome reputation, was impalement. This horrific method of execution involved driving a sharpened stake through the victim's body, often vertically, so they would slowly, agonizingly, slide down and die over hours or even days. Vlad employed this method on a scale unprecedented in Europe. His first major act of terror was against the very bourgeois nobles, who he believed had betrayed his family and kept Wallachia unstable. At an Easter feast, he rounded up the boyars and their families, had the elderly immediately impaled, and forced the younger, stronger ones to march for miles to build a new fortress without rest. Those who survived were then impaled. This wasn't just punishment, it was a clear, brutal message. Treachery would not be tolerated. The dread he instilled was encompassing. He executed merchants who dared to trade outside his prescribed routes, beggars who he deemed unproductive, and criminals of all kinds. His forests became known as forests of the impaled, gruesome displays designed to be seen by anyone approaching his lands. Chroniclers report scenes where entire fields were filled with thousands of impaled bodies, a horrifying spectacle meant to terrify both internal dissenters and foreign invaders. Psychologically, the act of impalement was designed for maximum impact. Public spectacle. It was a public, prolonged death, ensuring everyone witnessed the consequences of disobedience. Dehumanization. It stripped the victim of all dignity, turning them into a grotesque display. Ultimate warning. It sent an unmistakable message. This is your fate if you defy me. Vlad's goal was simple: to establish order and stability in Wallachia, no matter the cost in human lives. He saw himself as a righteous ruler, purging his land of corruption and weakness. But his methods plunged his realm into a profound, suffocating dread. The law was absolute, and its enforcement was a reign of terror, where the slightest infraction could lead to the most agonizing death imaginable. This was the birth of the Impaler, a ruler whose name became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty, and whose actions laid the grim foundation for the monstrous legend that would haunt the world as Dracula. Vlad's reign of terror wasn't just directed at his own people, it was a weapon against his most formidable enemy, the Ottoman Empire. Having spent years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, Vlad knew their immense power, their military might, and crucially, their psychology. He understood that to stand against them, he could not simply rely on conventional warfare. He needed to inflict a deeper, more profound dread. From a psychological perspective, Vlad's campaign against the Ottomans was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare through terror. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, brought a massive army estimated at up to 100,000 men to crush Wallachia in 1462. Against this overwhelming force, Vlad had only a few thousand men. His strategy was not to defeat them in open battle, but to break their will through psychological warfare and attrition. He employed scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells, burning villages, and evacuating populations, leaving the vast Ottoman army with no supplies and no easy targets. But his most infamous act, and the one that truly cemented his legendary dread, occurred outside his capital Targovic. As Sultan Mehmed II's colossal army marched towards the city, they were met with a sight of unimaginable horror: a forest of the impaled, for miles, leading to Targovic. Vlad had impaled an estimated 20,000 captured Ottoman soldiers and Wallachian traitors. The bodies were left to rot, creating a ghastly, silent monument to his brutality. The psychological impact on the Ottoman army was devastating. These were hardened soldiers who had faced countless battles, but nothing prepared them for this. The sheer scale of the horror, the stench of death, and the chilling message it conveyed that their opponent was a demonic figure who transcended all known rules of war sapped their morale. Sultan Mehmed II himself, a man renowned for his ruthlessness, was reportedly sickened by the sight. He turned his army back, refusing to push further into such a land of terror. Vlad's tactics, however horrific, achieved their immediate goal. The Ottoman invasion was repelled. He had used dread as a shield against overwhelming force. He showed his enemies that Wallachia was not just a territory to be conquered, but a nightmare realm where their very souls would be tormented. This episode reveals the chilling duality of Vlad, the Impaler. To his enemies and many of his own people, he was a monster. But to some Wallachians and later generations of Romanians, he was a ruthless defender, a national hero who, through extreme and terrifying measures, protected his land from invasion. This complex legacy makes him a figure of profound historical fascination, a testament to how desperation and brutality can forge both a monster and, for some, a twisted form of savior. Despite his terrifying victory against the Ottomans, Vlad's reign was far from secure. His extreme cruelty had made him many enemies, both within Wallachia and among his supposed allies. In 1462, after repelling Mehmed II, he sought refuge and support from his nominal ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. But instead of aid, he found betrayal. Matthias had Vlad arrested and imprisoned, likely due to political maneuvering and the growing international horror at Vlad's methods of warfare. From a psychological perspective, Vlad's final years were a tragic end for a man who had built his empire on terror. He spent over a decade in captivity, a grim echo of his childhood. The dread that he had so effectively inflicted on others now became his own reality. Details of his captivity are sparse, but historical accounts suggest he continued his dark practices, reportedly torturing small animals, further solidifying his image as a man consumed by cruelty. He was eventually released in 1475 and, in a final, desperate attempt, managed to reclaim the Wallachian throne in 1476, but his return was short-lived. Just a few months later, in December 1476, Vlad the Impaler met his own brutal end. The exact circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery, befitting such a fearsome figure. He was likely killed in battle against the Ottomans or their Wallachian allies, perhaps even betrayed and assassinated by his own men who had grown tired of his reign of terror. His head was reportedly cut off and sent to Constantinople as a trophy for Sultan Mehmed II, a final, grim irony for a man who had used the heads of his enemies as warnings. But the death of Vlad the Impaler was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his legend. Almost immediately, terrifying pamphlets and woodcuts began to circulate across Europe, recounting Vlad's horrific deeds, the impalements, the boiling alive of victims, the dipping of bread in his enemies' blood. These sensationalized accounts, often exaggerated for political purposes, painted him as a monstrous, almost supernatural figure of evil. This is where the anatomy of a myth truly begins. The name Dracula, meaning dragon or devil, combined with his unspeakable acts of impalement and bloodthirsty reputation, created the perfect ingredients for a new kind of monster. Centuries later, in 1897, an Irish author named Bram Stoker would stumble upon these tales. He was captivated by the name Dracula and the horrific stories of the Wallachian prince. Stoker, blending these historical horrors with Eastern European folklore of the undead, created the iconic Count Dracula, the vampire. The real Vlad the Impaler was not a vampire. He did not drink blood or fear sunlight. But his historical cruelty, his reign of terror, and the profound dread he instilled were so immense that they transcended history and birthed a myth that continues to terrify us to this day. The anatomy of dread reveals that sometimes the most enduring monsters are not born of magic, but of the very real, very human capacity for unspeakable evil. And so, the true, brutal story of Vlad the Impaler, the man who inspired the myth of Dracula, is laid bare. We have journeyed through his childhood forged in cruelty, witnessed his reign of terror, seen his psychological warfare against empires, and traced his final, mysterious end. We have watched a historical figure become synonymous with a fictional monster. So, why does the dread of Vlad the Impaler and the vampire he inspired continue to haunt us? From a psychological perspective, Vlad's story speaks to a primal human fear, the fear of absolute, unfeeling evil. He wasn't a monster driven by supernatural hunger. He was a human being who chose to wield terror as his ultimate weapon. The real dread is knowing that such cruelty can exist within us, born from trauma, ambition, and a ruthless will to survive. The anatomy of dread compels us to understand the allure of such figures. Vlad the Impaler embodied a form of evil that transcends mere villainy. He was a force of nature, a living nightmare who punished treachery and disorder with unspeakable acts of sadism. This raw, visceral terror is precisely what Bram Stoker tapped into when he created Dracula. Stoker understood that the historical dread of a man who impaled thousands could be transmuted into the supernatural dread of a creature that drinks blood and stalks the night. The legend of Dracula is, in essence, a psychological echo of Vlad's reign. The vampire's insatiable hunger for blood mirrors Vlad's insatiable hunger for control and vengeance. The vampire's ability to instill fear and command obedience reflects Vlad's terrifying authority over his subjects and enemies. The myth provides a supernatural explanation for a horror that, in reality, was deeply human. The enduring power of Vlad's story lies in its dual nature. Historical terror. He was a very real, very brutal ruler whose actions left an undeniable mark of dread on his era. Mythical resonance. His atrocities were so extreme that they propelled him into the realm of folklore, becoming the ultimate symbol of evil in popular culture. And this is the final, chilling lesson from our investigation. The story of Vlad the Impaler teaches us that some historical figures are so monstrous, so effective at wielding terror, that their legacy escapes the confines of history books and becomes woven into the fabric of our deepest fears. The anatomy of dread reveals that whether he was a prince or a vampire, the true power of Dracula lies in the eternal human fascination with absolute evil, and the haunting knowledge that the most terrifying monsters are often made not born of human flesh and blood. And so, the final investigation is now passed to you. After dissecting the man and the myth, what do you believe is the most terrifying psychological connection between Vlad the Impaler and the vampire Dracula? Leave your analysis in the comments below. Let's continue the discussion about this monumental figure and the enduring power of his dreadful legacy.